In this video, we will learn the key differences between permanent and transient models and why we use transient fields and models. Okay, what are the main, let's say, use cases for using transient models and fields? For this purpose, let's start creating some models. The first model we will be creating is a permanent model. Okay, this will be permanent. You don't need to enable the timestamps. Right now, we will be enabling post only. Okay, let's create another model called Transient Model, and this time we mark it as transient so that it will not be stored in the database. So as you see, whenever we mark it as transient, for example, if it is permanent, I can specify the endpoints. If I mark it as transient, since this model objects are not stored in the database, AutoGIC doesn't allow creation of the default CRUD endpoints and services. That's one of the key differences. This one, basically, right? For permanent models, you can store them in the database and you can get default CRUD operators. But for transient models, you cannot store them in the database and you cannot generate a default, let's say, CRUD endpoints and services. Another thing is the following: for permanent models, you can add fields, right? You can add like a permanent or transient fields. In a permanent model, you can add transient fields. Let's assume that we will have an integer 1, which will be a transient field, and it will have a value of 10. Okay. If I go to transient model, if I try to add a field here, that since the model is a transient, the transient models doesn't allow addition of permanent fields. By default, it is transient, so this means that every field that you will be adding to this transient model needs to be transient. That's why AutoGIC disables the permanent field here. Okay, let's put here also integer 1. Okay, value of 10. Yeah. So why do we use the let's say the transient models? The main usage area for transient models is to pass some input parameters to your services. Let me show you how. Let's go back here. Let's create a dummy service. Okay. If I get into the details of the dummy service, in here, either a single or multiple, if I select single, I can see here the transient model. This means that I don't store this information in the database, but I can get input in this format to my service and use those values in my service nodes. That's one usage for basically the main usage for the transient models. Okay. Another important feature is that, for example, if I put here some database related fields, let's say update object fields by query. Okay. For the updated object model, I can only see here the permanent models because this is a database operator. This is a data node that is updating the database. Since I cannot update any value, transient values in the database, I cannot see them here. So only the permanent models are displayed here. Similarly for all the other database nodes. Okay. Let's go back here. If I look to the transient model, we put here the integer 1, 10, default value of 10. Let's test this thing, what happens. So we've got this permanent model. Okay, we've got this permanent model create object. Let's run this thing. As you see, the transient model is calculated and the value is shown. This doesn't mean that the transient, this integer 1, 10 is stored in the database. No, it is not stored in the database. What happens is the following. AutoGIC, whenever you get value from the database or create new ones or update fields and so on, if there are transient fields in your model, AutoGIC automatically appends those transient values to your, let's say, data objects. That's what it's doing. So in this case, you can see 10 here, but this is not stored in the database. This is just for, let's say, for when we get the information or when we update or create a new object, transient values are also automatically calculated and added to the existing field values which are fetched from the database. Okay. So in a nutshell, this is what transient fields and transient models are used for. Another use case for a transient field is that I already provided this information, but let me repeat that again. For example, you might have like the first name, right? It's a required field. You can have a last name of a user. required field. Then you can create a, let's say, a full name transient field, which will be concatenation of first name plus space plus last name. That's another use for transient fields, right? So if I go back to here, if I do like John Adams, if I run this thing, I see the full name John Adams, which is concatenation of the first name and the last name. Okay, that's it for now. I hope this helps. Thanks a lot for watching.